So you guys, I was playing with the 100 blocks and I wanted to figure out some other stuff. Are there other patterns that make up this huge big guy? And what I noticed is that this little guy, there's 100 of them inside this big guy. And the other thing I noticed was that there are 10 of these long guys inside this big guy. And I thought to myself, wait a second, is there a way to represent this big hole in a different way? So I decided to take them apart. Take these apart to make this guy a bigger one. And what I used was a number line. So then as I took them apart, I had one, and I noticed that I could do this. I could place this number right here and say that this was 1 out of 10 because I took 1 out of the 10 that made it up. And I continue to do that by placing them evenly along and creating this giant number line. And as I place them, I place my number. Now I had 2 out of 10. I grabbed the third one and I had 3 out of 10. Then I had 4 out of 10. 5 out of 10. 6 out of 10. 7 out of 10. 8 out of 10. 9 out of 10, and my last one made up the 10 out of 10. Now what I had created was this huge number line that went all the way across. It broke this guy down. Now the interesting thing is that I ended up with the same thing, 10 out of 10. And what I noticed is that this big guy was one whole, which is the same as 10 out of 10. So now I can use the giant one to say that this big giant number line represented this one whole. They were equivalent. So I created this long number line by breaking down the 100th block. And what I did is I created fractions. And you saw where I created the 1/10, the 2/10, the 3/10, so on until I got to 10 over 10, or what we call the giant 1. But I wanted to see if there was another way of representing these fractions. So I decided to figure out a connection with the place value system. So I decided to create a place value, and I decided that what I was going to do, I was going to make the ones place be the 100th block. I was going to make the long block the 10th place, and I was going to make the smaller one the 100th place. And what I was going to do is I was going to place a decimal right there to signify that that's where I was going to break it down into decimals. Now it made sense because if the ones block represented the 1, it should be in the ones place. The other thing that made sense was since there was a decimal here, then my 1/10 would become 0.1. My 2/10 would become 0.2. My 3/10 would become 0.3. My 4/10 would become 0.4. And so on until I got to the very end. So now I had figured out 2 ways of representing the same amount. I used fractions when I broke the 100th block down, and then I found a connection and I broke it down into decimals. So my number line continued to grow. I had 1/10 represented with 0.1, 2/10 represented with 0.2, and so on. So what I had done is I had found equivalent ways of representing the one whole. I found equivalent ways of finding 1/10 by saying 0.8 or 8/10. I found ways of representing 6/10 by saying 0.6 or 6/10. So I love what I did with the 100 block. I broke it down into a huge number line, and what I discovered is that I could create fractions with it, and I could also create decimals. Now the fun part, I thought, hey, is there a different way of creating these and representing this big thing? And I did discover that we can represent it with 100%. Now what I noticed is that if this was 100%, this little guy was 10%. And by doing that, I was able to make equivalent representations of what I had done before. I had 1/10, 0.1, and now I had 10%. And all of these values were the same thing, which is what equivalency means. So I kept going down my number line, and that's what I did. I did 10%, 20%, 30%, all the way across until I got to that big giant one. Remember that big giant one? And that's the one where it showed me that it was 100%. Now the cool thing about it is that I also noticed that these little guys were also a percent. And remember that 100 of these make up this, so this must be 1%. Pretty cool, huh?